Welcome to the Multicultural Mindset broadcast. Your host is Dr. Laverne Haynes Collins, a licensed professional counselor, award-winning trainer, and keynote speaker. Dr. Collins is the author of Overlooked: Counselor Insights for the Unspoken Issues in Black American Life. Dr. Collins has also been a featured monthly columnist in the American Counseling Association's Counseling Today magazine with her Honoring Diversity column. Now, here's Dr. Collins.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Multicultural Mindset. We are all about helping clinicians and other behavioral health specialists and leaders, educators, teachers, pastors be as effective as possible in working with people of color. Our narratives as people of color are different, and therefore our responses to people of color are best serving the people when they are culturally appropriate and culturally relevant. So today we're going to talk about something that is, I think, extremely important and really very interesting. We're going to talk about attachment styles, insecurity, and faith as concepts for helping Christian women heal. And I'm so excited about my guest today in the person of Victoria Swaza. She is the founder of Victorious Counseling, serving people throughout the state of Georgia with telehealth counseling services. She provides faith-based therapy, specialized trauma therapy, relationship therapy, and what we're going to talk a lot about today is attachment-focused therapy. Victoria, thank you so much for being with us today. We're glad to have you.
Yes, Dr. Collins, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure. I know we're going to have an amazing conversation today. Now, listeners, I had the privilege of seeing Victoria present a phenomenal training a couple of months ago on this topic of the intersection of attachment styles, insecurity, and faith as concepts for healing Christian women. And I immediately said, I've got to have you on my podcast. And she readily agreed. So, Victoria, let me start by saying this. A lot of our listeners already know or have heard about attachment theory. But for anyone who might not be familiar with that, can you give us a very brief summary of attachment theory?
Absolutely, absolutely. So attachment theory was actually coined back in the 1970s, and it progressively morphed over time thanks to researchers and the early frontrunners in the field. But attachment theory is basically a psychological theory that posits that we as humans develop what's called an attachment style, which is how we eventually attach. Another way of saying that is relate to the people around us. Now, attachment theory really like takes off and is a lot of people know about it when we talk about romantic relationships, right? Because I don't know how many of your listeners are on social media, but there's all kinds of quizzes online that can tell you your attachment style and why your partner might respond to you a certain way. But really, attachment theory can be seen in all relationships, right? Not just romantic, but friendships, relationships with coworkers. I'm actually getting ready to do my next presentation with you, Dr. Collins. It's going to be on attachment styles and money. So how we attach shows up in all facets of our lives, really popular in romantic relationships. And that's usually what we see online. We have the 4 different attachment styles. So secure attachment is the goal, right? That's what we would like to work towards, or that's what we hope to develop at a young age. And then there's 3 different types of insecure attachment: anxious, avoidant, and disorganized attachment. Now our attachment styles are actually formed during our upbringing, during childhood, right? And really it's from attachments and relating to our caregivers. So whether that's your parent or grandparent, whoever raised you, whoever was the main source of affection and nurturing, if that person was consistently there, if that person acknowledged your emotions, if they showed up as a consistent caregiver. And research actually shows, we only need it 30% of the time. So parents who are listening to the podcast I don't want you to stress and think that you got to be super mom or super dad. That was reassuring for me to know as I'm getting ready to be a mom too. You don't have to always be there 100% because, we're not perfect people. Nobody can do that 100%, but
Right.
show up more often than not, emotionally available, emotionally ready for your child that you're taking care of, then they will develop what's called secure attachment. Now, what that doesn't happen, we get the three different types of insecure attachment, like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And I love the attachment theory model. The people that I serve in my practice community, when it's appropriate to use that, when I introduce it into the therapeutic process, most people are excited to learn something about themselves. And many people will go and they'll do their own study and research, and they'll come back and tell me things they've learned about their attachment style. So it is an excellent tool to use. Now, what about, as you're saying, it speaks to not just your romantic relationships, but even your relationship with, money. I mean, and concepts even, right? Other kinds of relationships. What about Christian attachment to God? Has anybody looked at that?
So yes, there's a small body of literature. I was excited to find it when I was doing my deep dive into the literature review that actually looked at individuals' relationship to God and or their higher being, right? So whoever they looked at as their higher power. And what the researchers found was that the individuals that took part in this qualitative study, they reported when for example when tragedy happens, this is something that I do. So I would either pray or the individual would they took an assessment that listed out what were some of the spiritual activities they engaged in, and the researchers found that the individuals who marked pretty high for they turned to their higher power, they turned to God for um comfort, for reassurance in those times, in those rocky times, times of trials and trauma. They were shown to have a higher attachment to God, which in the study was later then seen their attachment to people overall was better, right? So the individuals who had secure attachment to God also attached pretty well. They were pretty resilient. They were able to overcome life's challenges, as opposed to the population in the study who did not, or who did not report a high attachment to God. That population subsequently showed lower resilience, took them longer to rebound from trauma, trials, tribulations. And I think it makes a lot of sense when we just, as we're talking about it anecdotally, if someone who is spiritually grounded has that foundation and they know what they're going through is for either a higher purpose, or it's just not simply, oh my gosh, like life is just being unfair to me. They're able
Yeah.
to process and they're able to move more quickly through the healing process than someone who needs a little more reassurance that the world's not out to get me. I just don't, I'm just not, I'm not someone that just got dealt a bad hand. Like I can move through these
Yeah.
problems and traumas that are
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. So like you said, that secure attachment in those early developmental years, this is one thing that is we don't always think about, is that we're not just setting the stage for how our children will develop in relationship to other people, but we're setting the stage for how they relate to God, or as you say, I mean, a higher power. Or
Absolutely.
or is it that those who come into that spiritual relationship securely
Mhm.
attached can then manage other relationships according to that? Is there any research that speaks about whether or not spiritual attachment that comes uh, later in life, into whatever point you make that choices about your spiritual walk?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Which is it, a chicken or the egg thing? Which comes first? What do you think?
That's
Or
a
what
great,
does the research say? Or even as you said, even anecdotally, this is really
yeah.
good stuff. So is it a mix or what? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Collins. And I think we do need more research on this topic overall, so we can have some concrete, evidence-based, actual peer-reviewed literature on this. I think what happens is, and I'll start from the anecdotal perspective here. We hear a lot well, okay, I hear a lot. I don't want to say we hear a lot because I don't know who all listens to a podcast, but your relationships with your parents oftentimes impact your relationship with God, right? So if you are somebody that grows up knowing your parents or your father figure to be present, active there, it's easier for you to grasp the concept that God, your father, is nurturing and there for you and wants to see you go through life well, right? For those individuals who did not have that experience, who did not have consistent parental figures, or even, maybe their father was there, but they were emotionally absent. Maybe their father was verbally abusive. Maybe their father was critical. Maybe they were disapproving.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, those individuals, and this is what I've seen in my clinical experience as well, they see God that way, right? So they often see God as aloof, or they see him as he's just sitting up there. I heard one of my clients say it like he has his arms folded and he's just waiting for me to mess up.
Mm, the
That
distant God
addition,
who's looking from afar but doesn't really care or
absolutely.
engage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 So those feelings and ideas, and even the fact that my client was able to grasp that picture that comes from somewhere, right? It doesn't come from nowhere. It starts somewhere.
Yeah.
So on one end, I want to say that our childhood attachment does significantly impact our ability to be close to God, be close to our creator. However, I can't also discount the fact that oftentimes when people come into community, come into church community, they start to get to know God for themselves. That heals attachment as well, right? So we're really coming from two ends of the spectrum here because
Okay.
what my clients will often ask me, they'll say, well, should I just like stop talking to people or leave people alone until I fix my attachment style? And
Mm-mm.
back at them. And I'm like, I don't know if that's possible because we got to
Possible.
community. We gotta it's in community, hopefully safe, trustworthy community, right? That's what we want our clients to engage in before anything else. That's what teaches us. That's where we can mess up and have those ruptures and repairs, so to speak, and realize, okay, this individual, maybe they did hurt me in this instance, right? Intentional or not. But that doesn't mean that all people will, right? And I think that's what happens in the therapy room when somebody who is working through anxious or avoidant or disorganized attachment, when they come to therapy, oftentimes they're first playing all this out with a therapist. So first therapist is the secure base and the person that they're going to. And if the rupture happens during therapy treatment, how the therapist responds to that and how well they can assist the client in actually fixing that rupture with some repair, that helps heal attachment. And then, our clients get some confidence. They're like, okay, so I did it here with my therapist. So now I can go out into community and
Yeah.
I can have more relationships that feel more complex. And I always tell my clients this is a very experiential thing. We can't just heal our attachment styles. It'd be great if we could, but we can't just do it by reading books and listening to podcasts. We have to be in community. We have to be with people so we can feel,
Yes.
understand our trigger points, what's actually happening in relationship, not just what we perceive as happening because of other
Mm.
happen to us, but what's actually happening here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Therapy is the
Mm-hmm.
best time to really hash out. And I love going there with my clients. Okay, so you said that this person said this. Did they actually, and okay, this takes tact, right? Because we don't ever want to come across as therapists is that we don't believe our clients or we don't want them to not trust themselves. That's not it. We just want to be sure that what they're perceiving is actually happening because sometimes we're so used to people doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing that everything we hear from that point is rejection.
Yes. And people also sometimes get to the place where they hear what they feel or what they believe they believe their interpretation, but their interpretation is often based in feeling. They treat their feeling as facts, or they treat their feeling as a command. From a cognitive, behavioral thinking era perspective, we would call that emotional reasoning. And oftentimes, I think with attachment theory, as you're saying so eloquently, the expectation is there for a particular to for a particular feeling to arise, and the feeling arises even though what the person said was intended, and perhaps by others would be received as benign.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And I think, and I will say, Dr. Collins, I do primarily the bulk of my work with anxiously attached clients. And I think something that's really common in working with anxiously attached clients is the constant perceiving rejection or constantly misreading cues or really believing that this individual, whoever they're interacting with, whether it's romantic or friendship, is
Hmm.
thinking negatively about me, or, oh, they said this because I wasn't doing this well enough. There's a lot of internalization that happens versus what you
Yeah,
said, it really being benign, like the individual on the
yeah,
other end more
yeah,
than likely doesn't know that what they said impacted the person the way it did. But because there's a narrative, and I love to talk to my clients about what's the narrative that's playing out with you right now, because there's already a narrative that I'm not as likable, right? Or my needs don't matter as much, or I'm not as desirable. And once again, these were planted in childhood, right? So somewhere along the way, parents and caregivers and/or caregivers, the message was internalized that there's something wrong with me and that's why I'm not
mhm,
getting this need met. That's now what they're seeing, right? That's the lens that they see the world through. So really having to do some work to revamp the lens, right? Challenging.
yes,
Good old CBT. Let's look at the evidence here. What's the evidence that this individual actually feels this way? Have they said this to you before? Are they doing other things in areas of life that show you this? Is this how they show up? Is this other people's experience of them? Because that gives us information, right? That gives us some data to then say, oh, maybe this person's just standoffish and they don't show emotion well. So I'm interpreting that as I'm unlikable, but this individual, that it's all that it's that's their stuff, not necessarily my stuff. I love doing that.
yes, 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 as do I. And the other thing that I tend to see, sometimes I get an intergenerational glimpse, and I see, and I'm going to say this from the standpoint of myself being a descendant of enslaved ancestors, and I can see how anxious attachment has come down through generations.
Mm,
And
that's
today
deep.
we may only see one generation. We may see a mother, or a father and a son, or a mother and a daughter. We don't always take the big lens. I don't think we're actually taught that about these kinds of theories. But we always look at the parent as the start of, rather than the continuation of, anxious attachment in a ancestral line. And when you're coming from, and I'm not saying that only Black people or only descendants of enslaved ancestors would have this pattern, but I believe that when we are talking to people of color, that we can uh, inquire with how much they know about their ancestry. Most likely, if they are identified as African American in this country, most likely they are a descendant of enslaved ancestors, or that's the other word I want to use, sharecroppers, et cetera. So, can you speak to that ancestral component, and how that might help a person if they could see that, and not blame, so to speak, the caregiver or parent who raised them.
Absolutely. And I love the way that you phrase that, Dr. Collins, because I love to remind my clients we're not blaming, like when we're in therapy and the topic of parents comes up, because it can turn into a sensitive subject, right? I
Yeah.
know working with clients who really have a hard time just naming certain things happening. They often hear it as, oh, well, I don't want to talk bad about my mom, or my mom did the best she could. And absolutely, right? All of our parents did the best they could with what they
Mhm.
had, right? And that's always what I want to lead with my clients. Like, we're not ever going to be in here shaming and blaming our parents. We're going to
Right,
talk about this is just what happened. Like, if we were just going to state the facts, right? But what
right.
I love about what you're saying, Dr. Collins, is essentially this didn't start with me, this didn't start with them, right? This was a pattern. This was something that my father and mother unfortunately didn't receive from their parents for whatever reason, right? For valid
Hmm.
reasons, because they were
Hmm.
more than likely surviving, right? If we look at
Yes,
African American history, pretty much anybody that's non-white in America, they were
yes,
pretty surviving and tolerating
yes,
the way that they could.
yes.
And as a byproduct, unfortunately, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're trying to meet that bottom part of the pyramid first. We need safety, security, food before we can even get to love and belonging and self-actualization. Those things aren't, that's not the
Right,
priority, right? So
right.
although that's sad, and it's just something that we have to sit with and just know
Hmm.
it is not a personal choice a lot of the
Hmm.
time when we have
Hmm.
a caregiver who does not give what we wanted them to give. It is really, to your point, Dr. Collins, a part of the circumstances, a part of the social political climate at the time, the social injustices that were happening at the time. I don't even
You have
think
to
that.
look at context, right? You have to look at context. And you have to, but that requires even using a different part of the brain than the self-protective
Yeah,
sympathetic nervous system, right? Like that part of the brain that's always in gear, expecting threats and looking for threats. It means helping a person to overcome whatever traumas interfered with the development of healthy attachment styles. And sometimes that means looking, as we're saying, looking contextually, looking at something bigger and broader than one generation of interaction. Now, let me use that as a segue, because if we look at the context of the experiences of enslaved people in this country, well, it didn't, these issues didn't start with slavery, and these issues are not unique to African Americans, but we can see how it fits into a larger context. If you're coming from a Christian perspective, you can go back to Genesis and
absolutely.
say, how did Adam and Eve manage their shame
Oh, that's
by making fig leaves, covering, compensating, blaming, you know. But the core wound for humanity, if you're coming from a Christian perspective, was in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall of humanity. Um,
yeah.
when Adam and Eve made a choice that was not consistent with God's instruction, enter, enter moral evil, enter natural decay and destruction, enter human limitation, and enter relational challenges, hiding, detachment. Um, Again, Christian perspective, Adam and Eve were hiding, detaching from God by trying to cover themselves in fig leaves, to the
Good,
point that
Dr.
God had to ask, didn't have to ask, he knew where they were, but he had to ask for them to find out, where are you, Adam? Where are you? In other words, I see you, Adam, but where do you think you are in relationship to me? Are we still attached the way we used to be? So not
Yeah,
only do we have the opportunity, I'll say, to look at it in terms of a cultural context, but for those who are doing Christian counseling, they have the opportunity to look at it in a biblical context as well.
that's so
Your
good. Oh
thoughts on that?
yes, yes. And I think, Dr. Collins, that's why this work is so important when we look at attachment, and we have to think about the church and church culture,
Mhm.
because we see a lot of this stuff play out at church, right? Like we see within church interactions, within how some people might idolize their pastors. Like there's clearly some attachment stuff going on here, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, the way you just broke it down with scripture, that's not always explained, right? Or
Mm-mm.
we don't know. Okay, I'll say we don't
Mhm.
know. We don't know to
Mhm.
sit down and think about, oh, wait a minute. There's actually biblical evidence that this has been happening before we even got here. This is
Right.
when attachment ruptures and attempts to repair, that was
Yes.
God's attempt to repair was Jesus. But there have been attachment ruptures and attempts to repair from the beginning of time. And I think
Yes.
language, honestly, would get more buy-in from church, people who are leery of counseling and mixing counseling and church for whatever reason, or don't see it as viable or valuable. Understanding that these things are outlined in scripture, that we can look to scripture for examples of not just where the rupture happened, but how we can repair. Oh my God,
Yes.
that that's gold.
Yes.
That's gold right there.
Yes. 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 If we take that perspective, then we can actually talk about perhaps um, repairing these ruptures by exploring, as you said, how we're seeing God, like the person that you described who just saw God as distant. What would it be like to lean in? Maybe she could explore that. What might it mean to lean in and see if there would ever be an increased sense of or increased awareness of God in her life in some way?
And
So
seeing
go
God's
ahead.
character in the scripture as evidence for
Yes.
what we're talking through here today, right? Because I think a
Yes.
listener might hear this and they may be skeptical. I always like to think about, what are some arguments that I could potentially receive once I present something to the world? And some people say, and I've heard, well, I don't necessarily feel that in real time, or I can't see that, or
Mhm.
yeah, relationships are great because they're here in person, but God is not here in person. So
Mhm.
actually looking at scripture as your evidence and his character as
Yes.
evidence can be a rebuttal or a reframing for that.
Mm. Yes. Yes. Oh, that's good. That's good. Um, but for those now who are open to exploring some of this, secure attachment to God seems to have a protective role in the mental health of women, Black women particularly. Let's talk about that. A protective role.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts? What's the literature say as you've studied this so extensively?
And I'll first start off by saying the literature, so not just anecdotally or not just like our opinions, right?
Hmm.
The literature backs that women, so there was a study actually in that I presented on in a presentation for your cohort that looked at college women who had secure attachment and what that did for them, what the protective factors. When we say protective, we're just meaning how is this helping them? How
Hmm.
is it mitigating loss or um helping them through. I'll say it that way. I sometimes I
Hmm.
think some of our language can get lost to some people that are
Yes,
not
yes,
comfortable.
yes.
But secure attachment for Black women specifically, the study looked at Black women that went through a myriad of things in college, right? So we know what happens in college. There's all types of miss-ups, falling, get up, as there should be, right? Because most of us explore the world and get to know
In that
ourselves
age range, yes.
college. But what was shown throughout the study was those who were securely attached were able to manage and move through these bumps in the road, the shortcomings, whatever ruptures happened, a
Mhm.
lot easier, significantly with I would say less what's the word I'm looking for here? There wasn't as much hang up. They didn't need as much intervention. They didn't need
Ah,
as much assistance in processing through because they had
okay.
attachment, right? So, and this study looked at a broad range of things. They looked at risky sexual behaviors, they looked at drinking, they looked at a lot of the things that you would say would happen in college.
Could happen
And
in college, yeah.
right,
Hmm.
exactly. What this is what happens when we're young adults and we're doing things. And secure attachment in this study was shown to be a protective factor for these women at a young age, right? We're not talking about
Wow.
30, 40s. This is young
Right.
20. The oldest woman is
Wow.
25 years old.
Wow.
So
Yeah. Powerful.
yeah,
So
powerful.
how, yeah. How can, this is the last question I want to ask, and then I'll just give you a chance to share whatever else is important that we haven't talked about. But how can counselors incorporate this idea of attachment theory into their work with Black Christian women in a way that is culturally relevant and still clinically sound? And
Hmm.
for those that are practicing as Christian counselors or faith-based counselors, um, how can they incorporate that aspect in ways that are culturally relevant and still clinically sound? What's the intersection?
Absolutely. Dr. Collins, I think I want to first start off talking about awareness.
Okay.
I want to talk about awareness because as a clinician that operates as a clinician of faith, however, they want to put it, that works with Black women, I
Mhm.
think understanding, and I think you do a great job of this in your cohort, by the way, and also just and how you present information, understanding the context in which your client is presenting, right? So until we know fully what it means to this individual to be Black, what their church life looks like for them, or even if they're not Black or they don't go to church, what does it mean to your client to be the race they are, the culture they are, and to be involved in their faith? And understanding first what it looks like for them. So are they someone that's involved? Are they someone that has a large friend group, or where are we starting at? I think that's really important. So that way, when we start to get into whatever comes up in session, right? Like misunderstandings between people, fallouts between people, we have an understanding of where this client's starting. I think the danger and sometimes what happens with clinicians is that, this happens to everybody. I'm going to say this happens to everybody. Client starts with you and they just jump in with, then this is what's going on in my life. And I can't believe this person cut me off. And this person told me this, and now we're not friends anymore. And we're trying our best to validate and be empathetic and be responsive in that way to build rapport with our clients as we should. But if we know where we're starting, if we understand more of the client's landscape and just
Yes.
where they're at with relational skill building, that will give us direction in which way to move throughout the therapy process. If we don't know, then we're kind of just responding to, like one of my supervisors says, the cow, the crisis of the week. We're just going to keep responding to the cow. They're going to leave and come back and keep responding to the cow. We're going to put out the mini fires, but not seeing the pattern that could actually be playing out here. So I would say awareness is really important. Understanding of cultural context, of course, understanding attachment theory, and you don't have to be a guru, right? You don't have to go back and read all the seminal works, but just understanding like what it looks like, how it can present,
Mhm.
and what you as a therapist can do to help, right? Because that they're coming to us for a reason. We don't want to continue or was perpetuate. Yeah, you're right. You're always right. Go ahead. Yeah, everyone around you is wrong. That's really not helping our clients. And Dr. Collins, that's something that keeps me up at night. If I'm going to be 100% honest with you, I really think about there needs to be, and when my therapist taught this to me, and I use this forever. I'll use this forever. There has to be healthy compassion and accountability in a therapy. That is secure attachment for anyone who's listening, who's walking away from this podcast tomorrow. There has to be a healthy level of compassion and accountability. Does that make sense? Someone's accountable and there's also compassion. This, right? So
Yes.
if we are all compassionate to our clients and we're not compassionate, we are not modeling, right? We are
Yes.
contributing to what's playing out in their lives, right?
That's
That's
good. If we're not modeling it with accountability and affirmation.
yes, yes. And if I could just give a few more tidbits, if you're wondering, what does that even
Yes.
look like? Therapist, honestly, that looks like keeping your boundaries. That looks like keeping your no-show fee. That looks like being firm, okay?
Okay. Yes.
Honest, right? Because if you don't have accountability and boundaries with your clients, they're gonna think that's okay, right? But that's
Yes.
talking about healing attachment, we have to do all of it, right? We got to do all of it. And therapists, I love all of this so much. And this was a wake-up call for me. I had to do my own work. Why was I lax with certain clients and, not with others? right? It starts here. Therapist, know
Yes,
thyself.
yes.
We gotta do the work here too if we're gonna be able to help our clients process through it as well.
That's good. And when you talk about being consistent with your no-show fees and your
Mhm.
late cancellations, that's huge. I know some people who are very consistent with that within their practice, but there are a good number of us and who bend the rules here and there and whatnot. And that is
Mhm.
an excellent example of, like you said, demonstrating secure
Yeah.
attachment
Yeah.
styles. Absolutely. I like to say it as a term I learned rather, um, process over content,
Mm.
because the crisis of the week, the cow, that's content.
Mhm.
Process is overall, what's your pattern of doing? What's your pattern of responding? What's your pattern of feeling? What things are triggering you? What's really going on big picture? And that's where attachment style comes in. It helps you to see that big picture so you can look at process and not just
Love that.
content.
I love that, Dr. Collins. Yes, yes. Process
Yeah,
of that's so
yeah,
important.
yeah,
So
yeah. And that applies to what's happening with the members of your practice community outside of the counseling room and in the counseling space. The process right here is, in many cases, just a microcosm or a mirror of their processes out there. But this only happens with integrity whenever there is a strong enough rapport and a safety that
absolutely.
they can engage here in the same way they engage out there. Because we all know that when clients come in here, they're likely to, still have on the mask and they're still wearing some of those fig leaves, if we're using that biblical reference into Genesis chapter 3. Um, so make it authentic here so you can actually invite introspection into their processes, the cognitive behavioral processes, the emotional processes, the internal family systems. It really doesn't matter what model you're using, but you want to pay attention to the process and not just the content. Otherwise, as you said, you're just on a hamster wheel repeating the same dialogue every week because there's a new crisis every week, and all you're doing is processing that. So attachment theory gives you a way to see bigger, a way to see process. And I think that's one thing that is really extremely important. And as we've already talked about, the intersection, because people have intersecting identities, in terms of their gender identification, their racial or cultural identification, their ethnicity, perhaps, their faith identification, their relationship identification. I don't know what else I may have missed, but um, everything about us is an identity, and all of those identities merge. So Black, Christian, woman, right there are three identities, and then there are others. And we
Absolutely.
have to look at the intersectionality when we're talking about attachment. I believe a person, and I might be wrong here, but and tell me what you think. A person can have a strong attachment in one role, or have a stronger attachment style in one role, and then have a weaker attachment style in other roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they're not used to maneuvering in certain
Mhm.
spaces.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, if
yeah,
they're
yeah.
they can totally, and I've seen it play out, and it's funny because I'm like flashing back to people in my life who I've heard say these things, but you can be a great friend, right? Like you can show up for your friends in a certain way, and
Mhm.
then your partner doesn't feel like you show up at all, right?
Yes.
Because you're so used to being the friend, or you're just
Yes.
that's the role you played, right?
Yes.
So I think
Yes.
you're right, Dr. Collins. That's so true.
Yes. Yes. And don't we see that within the context of, and I'm going to go to the historically Black church for a minute.
Mhm.
This is so good. We could just go on because we're both passionate about these topics here. Um, when I think about the role of the traditional historical Black church and what attachment looks like there in that context, because for many people, the church is so much more, historically has been so much more than a place of worship. It has been so much more than a spiritual foundation. The church has been a social foundation in Black communities historically. Now, I know where things are different now, and we have online churches and we have transportation that we can go across town to be a part of a congregation that fits us or suits us. So we don't have this sense of community, geographic community, traditional churches to the same extent that we used to. But no matter how far you drive, when you get connected, that church can become your community, your social community, and that can even become the community that you serve. So we talk about attachment there. I think that in the historically Black church, there was an attachment to, for some people, not for everybody, but there's a different kind of attachment or connection between pastor and parishioner amongst people who are very active, especially in their churches. There are different kinds of relationships that happen in the church because the church has such a socio-cultural, political impact and representation that when we experience church hurt, and I'm getting ready to do a webinar on helping people heal from church hurt and spiritual wounds. I think that that's why church hurt is so painful, because it's a place where we expect perfect attachment, secure attachment. And when we have a breach or a rupture in those spiritual relationships, people are devastated.
Yeah.
Got to be aware of that, that
Trust there.
sometimes,
There's a lot of
yeah,
trust there.
trust. Yes, yes, yes. And people will sometimes look at those relationships person to person, and because that person to person relationship or that pastor to parishioner relationship occurred in the context of the church, then that person takes that as an indication of some kind of lost hope or uh, let down on God's part,
Right. Yeah.
that
It's
now I don't trust God anymore because the church was supposed to do this. The church being the people or the institution, either one. How can I continue to go to church so I have no more interest in God? Those kind of things come about at the intersection of church-based relationships, where expectations are that every relationship is going to have a secure attachment in the church.
and the expectation is what gets us every time. Expect the expectation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So many of our ruptures and breaches have to do with the discrepancy between expectation and experience. I expected this, but I experienced that. My expectation, my expectation was not met. And it's crushing. Interesting though, how we can bring it all back to attachment. And that's why I'm so grateful for your expertise in this area. All these intersecting parts, all these
And I
intersecting parts.
I'm grateful for your expertise, because I remember when we met about this topic, I was thinking so micro. You really helped me expand this. Like, no, like look at how this is showing up in the Black
Hmm.
church. That
Hmm.
was the first time anybody had ever pointed that out to me. So
Yeah.
yeah, that we really need to stay collaborative as therapists, because we can really
Yes.
go hone in on one thing, and it's so much bigger than that one
Iron
thing.
sharpens iron. Yeah.
You know what? That's so true. There's a scripture coming out right now.
Right now. Victoria, thank you so much for your time today. The conversation has been enlightening. It's been challenging. It's been validating, affirming, and just really, really on point. That's what I'm going to say. It's just been really, really, really on point. So I thank you for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to say, perhaps, to the audience before we wrap up?
I don't really have much else to say. I think
Okay.
I got everything, and then some
Yeah.
for today. I will say to whoever's listening that I am going to be giving a repeat of the training that I did with Dr. Collins Court, and I will be advertising it very soon.
Excellent. And I'll
So
be the first to say, when you see this advertised online, don't miss it. How can people find out about the trainings that you're doing? Can they go to your website or?
yes, you can go to my website, victoriascounselingllc.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Victoria Swazo. I'll be posting my updates there, ways to register for upcoming trainings. Um, I'm also on Instagram at the Victorious Counselor. If you're on Instagram, if you're an IG person, yeah, those are the ways that you can find me.
Excellent, excellent. I will be sure to put a slide at the end of this podcast with your contact information and where they can find you on the internet, your socials and your website, so that people can find you and they can be looking out for you and for these announcements about trainings that are to come. Thank you so very much for being with us, and to everyone who's watching or listening, thank you for being with us today. You can see how what I mean when I talk about looking at things that are culturally relevant in context. It's okay to use sometimes what we've learned in school, but Victoria's a wonderful example of how we take intersectionality and we take the specifics of a person's situation, and we don't dismiss or minimize the culture. We bring cultural factors such as being Black, such as being a Christian, being a woman, being growing up in a traditional historical Black church or something. How all of those things are relevant. So we don't ever want to um, leave such things in the background. We always want to bring them to the foreground. And that's what it means to be a multicultural counselor with a multicultural mindset. So please keep doing what you're doing, keep practicing with humility, with an open mind about equity and belonging and inclusion. And I will see you on our next broadcast.